Our text comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We'll read the first 5 verses there. Page 957 of one of the Pew Bibles in this church. It's 1 Thessalonians 3. It's 1 Thessalonians 3. Start reading at verse 1. So when we could stand it no longer, we thought it best to be left by ourselves in Athens. We sent Timothy, who is our brother and co-worker in God's service in spreading the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you in your faith so that no one would be unsettled by these trials. For you know quite well that we are destined for them. In fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted, and it turned out that way, as you well know. For this reason, when I could stand it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith. I was afraid that in some way the tempter had tempted you, and that our labors might have been in vain. Thus far, the reading of the text. Brothers and sisters, in May of 1940, England was at war with Nazi Germany. Every day, German bombers would fly over England and drop bombs on England's biggest cities. Submarines were sinking English ships, and men were dying on those ships. England had lost battle after battle, nearly lost her army in France. The situation seemed hopeless and bleak. Nazi Germany seemed too big, too powerful. But in May of 1940, England received a new prime minister, Winston Churchill. And Churchill was put in power because he said that he would fight. He would fight for victory. But as he took on his position, he said to the English people, you can have victory, but the only way is through suffering. In fact, as the prime minister who wants to win this war, I offer you nothing but suffering. He said to the English people, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. You might ask, well, how do the English people like to hear something like that? Nobody likes to hear that the next 5 years of their life will be nothing but suffering. But they agreed with him. They were willing to suffer. They knew the goal was worth the suffering. And so they agreed to follow him. What's fascinating about that story of English history is that it illustrates something powerful in Christianity too. When we choose to follow Jesus, when Jesus calls us and then we choose to follow him in return, Jesus offers us nothing but blood and sweat and tears. Jesus' offer of the gospel is very good. But to live with the gospel in this world is not good. It is suffering. You cannot believe in a Lord, Jesus, that the rest of the world hates, and do righteous things that the rest of the world does not like or want to do, and not suffer. And Paul makes this clear today to the Thessalonians in our text. This is why I picked the theme, for suffering we exist. This is his point in this passage. Now you may ask, well, how can this be? Well, let's work through this passage. We'll start with our first point to see how the Apostle Paul can possibly make the argument that Christianity is suffering. Let's start with our first point. We exist for it, and we'll start at verse 1. Paul says there, when we could stand it no longer, we thought it best to be left by ourselves in Athens. We sent Timothy, who is our brother and co-worker in God's service, in spreading the gospel of Christ. Now let's remember what's happening in Paul's life. Why does he need to talk about suffering? Well, Paul preaches the gospel in Thessalonica. People come to faith in the city. He gathers this small church there. He teaches them for a few weeks. And then he's run out of town by a Jewish mob. And Paul travels to Berea and Athens and later Corinth. And while he's in these other cities, he's deeply worried about the Thessalonians. Did they survive the test? They've now suffered for Jesus. What did that suffering do to them? They try to return. They cannot. And finally, they agree to send Timothy, who apparently was not with them when they were there the first time. It seems that Paul and Silas couldn't return for some reason. The devil blocked them. It could have been because their names were, the believers in Thessalonica promised the authorities that Paul and Silas would not return in order to be let out of prison. That could be why. But Timothy can go and they can't. This is a huge sacrifice for Paul. He's so concerned about the Thessalonians that he's willing to lose one of his co-workers for a month or however long. And traveling alone is dangerous in the Roman Empire. It's a little bit like here in Brampton. You as a church agree to send your pastor or your elders away for a month or two. It is a sacrifice. And for Paul, it's huge. But he's so worried about the Thessalonians. And if you remember the parable of the sower, the seed is scattered on different types of soil, and different types of soil represent a different kind of reception of the gospel. The gospel is the seed. And one of the types of soil is the shallow soil, where the seed lands, and people believe for a while, and then when the going gets tough, when the heat of the sun comes, the seed and the plant die. And Paul's worried that this is what happened to the Thessalonians. So he sends Timothy. What is Timothy going to do? Well, it says here, Timothy is going to strengthen and encourage you in your faith so that no one would be unsettled by these trials. This word for strengthen is to fix in place, to anchor. So you can see that the contrast between anchoring in place versus being unsettled and shaken by the trial. And Paul's going to encourage to walk alongside the Thessalonians so that they're fixed in place, that the trials don't shake them. Now, here's the great question of the text. Why would the Thessalonians be shaken or unsettled by trials? When does a trial or suffering shake you? Well, mostly it shakes you when you think it shouldn't happen. A Christian is shaken in his or her faith when he or she thinks that he or she should not have to suffer. If suffering is an anomaly, something out of character in part of being a Christian. If suffering is an unusual event and shouldn't happen, it certainly shouldn't be drawn out. If suffering is not part of following Christ, then it will shake you when it comes as part of following Christ. It's worth asking the question, I think, today as we explore this. What is your view on this topic? Do you think, as North Americans do, universally, that suffering is an interruption of the good life you deserve? It's Tim Keller's way of putting it. Do you think that your faith should make your life easier rather than harder? Have you listened to pastors who say that believing in Jesus and giving money to the church should make you comfortable, wealthy, and healthy? Have you participated in a type of Christianity that is basically paganism, where you pay God to give you good things? That's how the Baal cults in Israel used to work. You would give your animals to the pagan shrine, and then you expected the god to bless you with fertility. Some modern forms of Christianity basically amount to that. But here in this text, we see that following Christ is exactly the opposite. I mean, Christ is good, and receiving Christ is a profoundly good thing. But it leads to suffering in this world. Look at what Paul says, and this is a shocking statement. He says, no one would be unsettled by these trials, okay? For what? For you know quite well that we are destined for them. Destined for what? Destined for trials. And actually the Greek is much simpler. The Greek is, we exist to suffer. What? You know, when Jesus told his disciples in the book of John that suffering was part of following him and that his life was suffering, lots of them left. No, this is too hard. And one commentator says this. He says, Paul is not thinking of a period of persecution which will pass, and then the church returns to normality. No, normality is persecution. Brothers and sisters, this is a shocking and hard teaching. Now, let me qualify it. There's some things that should be said. Paul is not saying that we should look for suffering. Not so. Suffering is a byproduct of living for Christ. Nor is he saying that suffering in itself is good. It is not. Suffering is evil. The point is that being a Christian in a sinful world entails suffering. You cannot be good. You cannot say you follow Jesus in a world that hates both of those things and not suffer. Now, there are layers to suffering. Here's the second qualification. There's a few layers to suffering. I want to walk through them to get this right. First, it is true that everybody in this world, Christian or not, suffers things like sickness or poverty, personal breakdown or personal health struggles, relationship breakdowns. Every human being suffers this, Christian or not. Our world is full of this. And so you could say we exist to suffer these things, and in a sense we do. In fact, many Stoics and philosophers and even many Hindu religious men have argued this way. Buddhism, to some extent, sees it this way. But this is not what Paul's talking about, is this type of suffering. That's not really the point of this passage. And this leads to the second. There's a second layer to suffering. And these are things that we often suffer many things in our lives that are our own fault. We are foolish in our sin. We do things that create consequences. We do damage due to our own lack of wisdom and sin. For example, in our arrogance, we offend families, our family members or friends. They become distant. We suffer. Again, that's not what Paul has in view here, really. It's the third thing. Paul is talking about suffering for Jesus. Suffering because you've claimed the name of Jesus. You carry his banner. We will suffer for following Jesus and rejecting other religions and truth systems. And this is what Paul constantly faced. If you read Acts 17, verse 5, you can see how Paul and the Thessalonians suffered in Thessalonica. I'll read it to you. The other Jews were jealous. They rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, now listen carefully, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house." Let's imagine this for a second. We all live in houses in Brampton. A mob comes to your door, they break down your door, they drag you out, and they carry you off to the judge at City Hall. That is suffering. And Jason this new believer, who was only a believer for a few weeks, if we can understand this passage right, after a few weeks of following Jesus, he's dragged to the magistrate, through the streets with his mob, nearly escapes death. Imagine that's terrifying. And you can imagine the Thessalonians asked themselves the question, Paul had a beautiful message when he came to us, but is this what following Paul's God is? This is the kind of thing that's going to happen to us through what Paul says? I'm not sure. What's going on here? Imagine I came to you and I sold you a product. And then couple of weeks later, the product malfunctioned and created a fire in your house and created all sorts of chaos. And you came to me and said, hey, I bought this product from you. Why is it causing damage to my house? Why is it not doing this? And I said, this is how it's supposed to be. You'd be furious. You can see that Paul is worried the Thessalonians will see it that way. Is this what being a Christian is? And Paul is saying, yes. Yes. And he actually later says in our text in verse 4, he says, actually, I warned you this would happen. I did not sugarcoat the truth. I told you this would happen. It happened exactly as I said. I did not lie to you. And neither should preachers today do that, by the way. In fact, things have not changed in our culture or in our world, have they? If you become a Christian in North Korea, you are subject to death. In Pakistan, Christians are harassed and their houses are burnt down. Mobs chase them out of the city. Many of them have immigrated overseas to get away. They live in this city, many. And what do you think would happen to you in Canada if you went out to protest the Pride Parade? What happens if someone opposes Pride events in their sports stadium? What happens to their career? Sometimes they get away with it, sometimes they don't. What happens if you walk into a mosque and talk about Jesus? There is a cost to following Jesus, and the cost is the hate of many people. And Jesus even says in Luke chapter 14, he talks about this very thing, and he uses two parables, very interesting. And Jesus says, listen, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to pick up your cross to follow me. And he says, don't become a Christian if you're not willing to do so. He says, look, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Whoa. What do you think he means by that? If you become a Christian but you're not willing to suffer, it's like building a tower and not finishing it. And he says, you will be ridiculed. People in the world will ridicule you because you claim to follow Jesus, but when the going got tough, you abandon him. They will ridicule you rightly. And then he says in verse 33, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Ouch. Now, what's incredibly merciful on God's part is that often we are not required to give up everything we have. I think the point is more, you should be ready to. If it should come to that, you have to be ready to do so. If you're not ready to do so, you don't understand discipleship. If you want to be a Christian, you must be ready to pay the price. And in a sense, you do give up everything to be a Christian. And you should be ready to, and that should have consequences for how you live your life now. However, it is true that not all of us will be martyrs. So, in a sense, we get to keep our lives until we die. And again, Paul says it clearly. It's in verse 4. He says, look, in fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted, and it turned out that way, as you well know. It will happen. It did happen. And so it's worth pointing out today that you are now told through the word and by your pastor, suffering will come for us in this church. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a week, maybe not in a year. It will come. Now you know. And the fact that we've been warned, I think, makes it far easier when it comes. It's a lot easier to grieve the death of a loved one if we knew it was coming and were able to say goodbye than if they are taken away immediately. Some of us have seen this. Well, we know it's coming. Now we can get ready. I've often thought that something we need to do in the church is recast our teaching as a church into persecution training. So that when persecution comes, we'll say, oh yeah, we were trained for that. Let's do it. And of course, I want to add another layer. We suffer for following Jesus. We also suffer for being righteous like Jesus. This is another layer, and I think it changes things a bit. 1 Peter 3, verse 14, it says, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Matthew 5, verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. And so it's not only that we suffer because we're Christian, we suffer because we become righteous like Jesus. And I think many of us I think hits home a little more for us. In Canada, we don't suffer so much yet for following Christ, but we do suffer for our righteousness. That's definitely becoming obvious. In a world where human beings want to be their own God, where they want to define their own righteousness, people who say righteousness is defined by Jesus will be maligned. In fact, our world has gone backwards. Things that we say that Jesus says are righteous are now laudable and praiseworthy in our world. And so to be Jesus is actually to be evil to the world. And some of us are struggling with this in detailed ways. Think about many of us have family members who attack us because we've had to put boundaries up against their sin. We have employers that are not happy with us because we refuse to overwork or put up pride balloons in our office, or who don't participate in financial corruption, or schools that think Christians are bigoted because they refuse to participate in the raising of the pride flag, or because the parents are teaching their kids something other than what the teachers are. Neighbors who are offended by the generosity of Christians and the witness. We are starting to pay the price for our righteousness in this world. It bears a price in a world that doesn't want it. 1 Timothy 3, verse 12. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Notice carefully. Godly life in Christ Jesus. They may not even know yet that you follow Jesus. Just by being godly, you will already experience it. And there's another layer on top of this yet. Goodness itself is suffering. Think about it. Forgiveness is suffering. What are you doing when you forgive someone? When you forgive someone, you are saying to the person, you sinned, you hurt me, you did something evil to me, and instead of me pursuing the justice your sin deserves, I'm going to release you from the debt. I will take the hit for your sin rather than you, because I know Jesus has taken the hit for my sin. Suffering by definition is suffering. Forgiveness is to suffer, is to choose suffering rather than retribution. Even to love also is suffering. It is self-denial. Every act of love requires denying myself something I want. To give up what I want for decades in my marriage for the sake of the other person. Even if they never return it. In a world of sin, you cannot love without suffering. There's no righteousness without suffering. And that's why when Christians think, they think the following Christ can come without suffering, it neuters their righteousness. It's death to righteousness. Look at what Peter says. He says, whoever suffers in the body is what? Done with sin. The connection is unmistakable. If you can't suffer, you can't be righteous. But if you are willing to suffer, sin will have no hold. Why? Because sin's promise is that you can escape the pain of this world. Most sin is a temptation to have a shortcut, to have a more self-pleasing thing than what is right. A way to seize pleasure when I want it rather than when God grants it. So, I must say to you, based on this word, as your pastor, do you want to be a Christian? Do you want to follow Jesus? Do you want us in this church to conduct your funeral? Then, I promise you nothing but blood, toil, sweat, and tears. And hate. Now, all that said, that's the bad news. You see, the bad news is also tied to good news. This is our second point, the value of suffering. You see, suffering is not all bad. It is evil, but good is created out of it. You see, in the Bible, if you read the New Testament and the Old, suffering is always described as good for the Christian. Luxury, ease, wealth, and comfort are usually seen as risky and potentially damaging. And in looking through the New Testament, I've identified at least 13 positive effects of suffering. There are probably more. I'm not going to list them all today. I don't have time. But there are a lot of benefits to suffering for Jesus. And in my investigation of the New Testament, there's only one potential harm of suffering. And that is that suffering might lead us to leave or abandon Jesus. Actually, in verse 3, Paul says, his one worry is that the suffering would unsettle the Thessalonians. And then he says in verse 5, I was afraid that in some way the tempter had tempted you and that our labors might have been in vain. His fear is that the suffering would lead the Thessalonians to abandon Christ. That's the only potential problem and harm of suffering. This is the thing that the devil wants. The devil wants to convince you that you can have an easier life apart from God rather than with Him. He wants to take our faith away from us, accuse us of our sin, and make us feel depressed and awful and guilty all the time so that we never seek the forgiveness of Christ. And it's deception, you see, because it's not true. It's not true that your life would necessarily get easier in the long term apart from God rather than with Him. Look at Peter says in 1 Peter 3 verse 7, it is better if it is God's will to suffer for doing good than for evil. In other words, suffering does not end just because you abandon Christ. In fact, you just invite a new suffering. Evil is the worst form of suffering. Eventually you will suffer for your evil. Your evil will destroy your relationships. It will cut you off from the people you love. And it will eat you up inside. And soon you will end up on the streets alone with nothing. Because your evil will corrode everything that is good in your life. So what's to gain from abandoning Christ? Temporary pleasure? Perhaps. Now let's look through the good things that will come when we suffer for Christ. I'll list a few of them for you. I don't have time for all of them today. Here's a sample. Psalm 119, verse 71. It says there, It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. So the psalmist, by suffering, it turned him towards God so that he would learn more about God. It sobered him. He says, look, verse 67, before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your word. Affliction smartened me up. It showed me how good you are in a world of evil. That's number one. Number two, our faith grows through affliction. James 1, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because, why? You know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work. Why? So that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Suffering is essential to becoming mature as the Christian and learning to persevere through hard times. And I think it's not just persevering, it's persevering in love. To be able to be loving and kind and gracious even when going gets tough. Only suffering can really teach us that. And Romans 5 echoes this very similar teaching. So your faith deepens and grows and endures in a different way. That's number two. Number three, in the Bible, the same word is often, the word for temptation also is a connotation of testing. Now, when you test something, and we think of a mineral. You have silver, you heat it up, and you heat it up, so two things. So to discover how pure it is, and number two, to burn off the impurities and separate them somehow. And in 1 Peter 1, verse 6 and 7, Peter talks about how affliction has this purifying effect on us. It tests our faith and shows us where our faith actually is so that we can learn to grow it, A, or B, we can burn off the things that hinder us. It purifies us. That is very good. It's good to purify silver, it's good to purify gold, and it's good to purify Christians in the furnace. Number 4, suffering destroys pride. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7, Paul says, the gospel came to you in a jar of clay. Why? To show the surpassing glory of God. The gospel comes in a suffering, weak person. An affliction, and Paul in that chapter is talking about affliction. He's afflicted, he's afflicted. He's enduring the death of Christ so that the resurrection of Christ would emerge. The suffering afflicted him so that the glory of God would emerge. The human pride would not be Paul's message, but the power of God. And when we suffer, and we bear it, and we maintain our faith, then the glory of Christ begins to emerge. And ultimately, that is why we suffer, is to give Christ glory. But Christ will only get glory if you are humbled. If you think you survived your suffering through your own strength, Christ gains nothing. That's why prayer is the way through suffering. If you can't pray, you can't suffer. If you can't pray, you won't suffer and you won't survive it. In fact, we could argue sometimes, based scripturally, that sometimes we suffer specifically so we learn to pray. Number 5, suffering increases our ability to comfort others. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 4, who comforts us in God, who comforts us in all our troubles. Why? So that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. So when we suffer, the things that God comforts us with, the comfort he provides in those moments, becomes something we can use to comfort others when they suffer. So if we never suffer, we don't have much for those who do. That's a very good consequence of suffering. Number 6, suffering successfully, passing the trials, offers us assurance of our faith and salvation. Maybe Luke 14, verse 20, Jesus says there, whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be their disciple. And so, if you do carry your cross, how much more then are you proven to be his disciple? James 1, verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because, having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Persevering under trial, we show that the only way we survive trials is if God carries us through. And so if God carries us through the trial, then obviously he loves us and we are filled with him. What a joy it is to receive that kind of assurance. Again, if you can't suffer, you can't have assurance. Or if you won't. If you won't suffer, you will probably sin. You will continue to be proud. You won't have any comfort. You will be selfless and self-satisfied. And your faith will constantly be blowing in the wind. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17, for our might and momentary troubles are what? Achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Here we have the final and greatest good of suffering. Number 7, Philippians 3, verse 10. I want to know Christ. Oh, how do I know Christ? I could read the Bible and go to church. I can pray. Yes, good. But what does Paul do to know Christ? Look, I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection. Yes. And what? Participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. I want to know Christ, so I participate in his suffering and dying. Therefore, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. So as I suffer for Christ, the resurrection of Christ emerges and becomes my life. And so when we suffer for Jesus and for his righteousness in this life, we are given intimacy with Jesus by those very things. Why? Well, because Jesus is the opposite of what this world is. Everything Jesus is what this world hates. This world loves to be its own God. It loves to sin, loves to determine its own morality, loves to reject God and build towers of ignorance to him. And if you don't do that, people will hate you. And Jesus was most pure and holy, the person who ever lived, and therefore endured the most direct, and the persecution was so direct and so immediate. Often the reason we don't suffer like Jesus is that we're just not a whole lot like him yet. Not necessarily. There's a connection. And Jesus suffered in his holiness every minute of his life. He suffered as he walked in the stench of our sin. Every town he walked through, he knew intimately the sin of every person in the town. He smelled it. Every person who interacted with him had selfish motives, and he knew it. And he was maligned, and he was mocked. Nobody loved him as he would have loved them. He's tortured, whipped by the cruelty of man. And they loved it. The soldiers laughed as they tortured him. Because humans love sin. They love violence. That's why there's such a thing as gladiators. Why? Why was Jesus maligned and hit and hated? Because he dared to be holy and gracious and loving to a fault. because he dared to come and save the people who hated him. And so the world wanted to kill God, and they did. But he triumphed by rising from the dead. And therefore, by showing that if we're willing to die, we can have resurrection from the dead in eternity. And by suffering for us, Jesus showed us that the King can redeem us too. Because to redeem anything requires suffering in a world of sin. Do you want to save your neighbor? Do you want to save your parents? Do you want your children to be saved? Then suffer for them by loving them. That's what Jesus did for you. Don't just tell them what to do. Love them like Jesus would, as you tell them. And by so doing all of those things, you will begin to deepen your intimacy with Jesus, because you will live as he did. You will begin to see what he saw, and he will begin to fill you with himself as you begin to live like him. The resurrection power comes as we die. And we will go, oh, this is why Jesus' life was so hard. Oh, he did this for me. Oh, man, I need to worship this man. That's what he did, what I'm doing. I can barely do it, but he did it with joy. So brothers and sisters, today, choose Jesus, not sin. And by so doing, be ready to suffer. Do not consider the illogic of choosing Satan or sin rather than Jesus. It would only be a temporary reprieve, if that. No, come to Jesus and live in him and follow him as his disciple. And he will give you an eternity without suffering. He can do that. He wants to do that. He's telling you right now that he's willing to do that. He died to make it possible. Come to him. But come to him being ready to count the price. But the reward is far bigger than the price. Never forget that. Amen.